My name is Eli, and I'm 30 years old. On my 6th birthday, my father left me at a barn and never came back. No goodbye, no explanation, just the sound of his truck tires on gravel fading into the silence of cows and cold air. I stood there clutching a balloon and a slice of cake in a paper napkin. It was supposed to be a surprise outing. Instead, it was abandonment disguised as a birthday gift. That moment split my life in two before the barn and after. This isn't a happy story, but it's mine. Let me know if you've lived something like it. For 25 years, I didn't speak his name. People said maybe he died or maybe he just snapped, but I never stopped searching. And when I finally found him living quietly, respected, successful, it took everything in me not to scream. So I did something else. This isn't a happy story, but it's mine. Let me know if you've lived something like it. If you haven't subscribed yet, join us now for more stories like this. I planned my next birthday, carefully, precisely, with an invitation he wouldn't dare decline. This isn't just a story about being abandoned. This is about what happens when you turn pain into purpose and scars into strategy. And it ends where it began, with a barn, a cake, and a man forced to face the child he tried to forget. Stay with me, because his fate was exactly what he deserved. I remember the morning sunlight hitting the chipped windowsill of my bedroom like it was yesterday. I was 6, and I had already put on my favorite red sneakers before breakfast. My mom wasn't around anymore. She'd left 2 years prior, but my dad, Sam, promised this birthday would be different. "You'll remember this one forever," he said, while ruffling my hair with the kind of smile that makes a kid trust too easily. I thought maybe we were going to a carnival, or that he had saved up enough for a real cake this year. There was something about the way he looked at me, almost like he was trying to memorize my face, that didn't sit right, but I was too excited to question it. He handed me a small gift box at the kitchen table. Inside was a toy compass on a string. "So you never lose your way," he said. I didn't understand then how cruelly ironic that would become. I wore it like a necklace, not knowing I'd be clutching it in a barn hours later, crying into hay bales while the sun sank without him. He packed me into the truck just before noon. I remember the engine stalling twice, like it was giving him a chance to stop what he was about to do. I sat in the passenger seat with my legs swinging, asking questions he didn't answer. "Are we going to the zoo? Is it a surprise party?" He just smiled and said, "You'll see." The ride was long and quiet. We drove past town, past the lake, and into an area I had never seen before. Trees grew thicker, fences rusted more, and the road turned to dirt. Eventually, he pulled into a gravel path that led to an old, broken-down barn. There was no one there, no balloons, no animals, just silence and the creaking of wood in the wind. He opened my door, helped me down, and told me to go inside while he grabbed something from the truck. I ran in, still hopeful. The barn smelled like dust and mold and forgotten things. I waited. Minutes passed, then more. I stepped outside to find the truck gone. No engine, no sound, just the compass resting cold against my chest. I waited until dark. I screamed until my voice cracked. And when I finally stopped crying, I swore I'd never let anyone make me feel that small again. That night, I learned what it meant to be discarded, not lost, not misplaced, but intentionally left behind. The barn didn't just take my innocence. It carved out a question I would spend the next 25 years trying to answer. Why did he do it? And more importantly, what would I do when I finally found him? I didn't know then, but this was the last birthday I would ever celebrate without a plan. A plan not for candles or cake, but for justice. The wind howled louder once the sun dipped behind the trees, as if even nature was mourning the truth I hadn't yet accepted. He wasn't coming back. I sat outside that barn with my knees tucked under my chin, watching the dirt path he'd driven away on, hoping the truck's headlights would reappear, but only shadows came. I had stopped crying by then. My body was numb, but my mind was burning. It kept rewinding the last few hours, searching for a clue, a sign, anything that would explain why my father had just driven me to the middle of nowhere and vanished. There was none. I kept replaying the look in his eyes when he gave me the compass. It wasn't joy. It was guilt, the kind that hangs heavy in a person's chest. He knew. He knew he was leaving me for good. And yet he let me believe it was a birthday surprise. That drive was supposed to be the beginning of a memory. Instead, it was the slowest goodbye I never saw coming. Every tree we passed, every pothole we hit, was another inch closer to being abandoned. By midnight, I was curled up in a pile of hay, trying to stay warm. The compass dangled from my neck, the only thing he'd left me besides questions. A part of me still clung to the fantasy that maybe he was testing me. Maybe I had to stay the night and prove I was brave. Maybe he'd come back with cake and balloons and say, "You did it, champ." But morning came, and with it, the truth. He hadn't just forgotten me. He had planned it. That made it worse. The barn was empty, except for a rusted wheelbarrow, a torn tarp, and some broken tools. There was no food, no water, and no comfort, only a cold silence that screamed louder than any explanation. I stumbled toward the road after the sun rose, gravel biting into my sneakers. I didn't know where I was going, but I figured someone, somewhere, had to be nearby. I walked until my legs trembled and my voice was hoarse from calling out. Eventually, a woman in a pickup truck saw me from the road and pulled over. Her name was Marlene, and she became the first real kindness I experienced after the worst betrayal of my life. She brought me home, gave me food, called the police, but even as I sat at her kitchen table wrapped in a towel, I couldn't speak. I didn't have the words for what had just happened. The authorities searched for my dad, but there was nothing to find. No trace, no forwarding address. It was like he had erased himself from the earth the moment he left that gravel path. That ride didn't take me to a birthday party. It took me to the end of my childhood. I had no idea that it would take me 25 years to finally ride that same road again, this time, with a different ending in mind. The image of Marlene's flannel shirt and warm smile burned into my memory. Not because she rescued me with fanfare, but because she looked at me like I mattered, like a child who had been wronged, not a burden waiting to be explained. She didn't ask too many questions that first day. She just listened when I was ready, and when the police left empty-handed, she offered me her spare room until a foster family could be arranged. That room became my world for the next 3 weeks. It was small, with fading wallpaper and a quilt that smelled of cedar, but it was clean, safe. Still, every night when the lights went off, I was back in that barn, back in the silence filled only by the buzzing of flies and the creaking of wooden beams that felt like they might fall on me at any moment. I remembered the way the hay scratched at my arms and the way the smell of rotting feed clung to my skin even days later. The barn had no light except what bled through the slats in the walls, casting crooked lines across the floor like jail bars. It didn't take long for me to start having nightmares, dreams of my father's truck pulling up again, but this time it wasn't him behind the wheel. It was me, older, angrier, and silent. The first foster home was a couple who collected children like knickknacks. They dressed me well, smiled for caseworkers, but behind closed doors, they offered no love, only rules. No one talked about birthdays or abandonment. It was as if my past had been folded up and stored away with the rest of my belongings. I learned quickly that if I didn't speak about the barn, it didn't exist. If I didn't cry, I wouldn't be noticed. If I smiled, even when it hurt, I was more likely to stay in one place longer. So I smiled. I excelled in school. I colored inside the lines, kept my shoes clean, and only cried when no one could hear. But I never stopped thinking about that barn. I remembered every crack in the wall, every shaft of light, every whisper of wind that made the whole place feel like it was breathing. I used to imagine that if I ever went back, I'd find something there, a clue, a note, a sign that he regretted what he did. But I also imagined something else, that I'd be the one behind the wheel this time, that I'd be the one deciding when to leave. That barn wasn't just the place he abandoned me. It became the backdrop of my becoming, a dirty cathedral of betrayal that haunted me in quiet moments. And no matter how far I moved, no matter how clean the room or kind the stranger, that smell of hay and flies lingered somewhere deep in me. I knew I would return one day, but not as a child, as a man, and I wouldn't be the one crying this time. Marlene never asked for anything in return. She just kept showing up with warm meals, clean socks, and an unspoken understanding of what silence meant in a child. Maybe she had her own ghosts. She never told me, and I never asked. But the way she stood in the doorway that day she found me skinny, shaking, caked in dust, and dried tears, there was something in her eyes. Not pity, not confusion, just recognition, like she had once been left behind too, and maybe that's why she couldn't drive past me like the others did. When the police report was filed and I was placed in the foster system, I thought I'd never see her again, but she came to every hearing, every transfer, every school meeting. She had no legal ties to me, but somehow she became my anchor. I still remember waking up in her guest room that first morning. She had tucked the blankets in so tightly I could hardly move, like she thought maybe being held by anything might help me sleep. It did. For the first time in days, I didn't dream about the barn. I dreamed about pancakes. And when I wandered into her kitchen, there they were, already on the table. She acted like she didn't notice the way my lip trembled when I sat down. She just poured orange juice and said, "You can sit here as long as you need to." And I did. I stayed silent that morning, and the next. But on the third day, I whispered the words I hadn't said since that ride in the truck. He left me. She didn't flinch, didn't gasp. She just nodded slowly and said, "Some people walk away because they can't carry what they broke." I didn't understand what she meant then, but I would, in time. As I grew older and bounced from one house to the next, I carried her words with me like the compass still tied around my neck. She gave me more than shelter. She gave me language, a way to speak the unspeakable. Every therapist, every teacher, every social worker who sat across from me got a different version of the truth, but Marlene was the only one I ever told everything. She didn't judge me for the rage I felt, or the guilt, or the ugly fantasies I sometimes dreamed up when the pain felt too big to hold. Years later, when I finally aged out of the system, I found a letter waiting for me at the last foster home. It was from her. It simply said, "When you're ready, I'll be right where you left me." And she was. Still in the same little house, with the same creaky porch and smell of cinnamon oil in the hallway. I didn't know it yet, but reconnecting with her would become the first step in unraveling everything. Because she was the one who would eventually help me find him, not by tracking him down, but by reminding me I still had a voice. And that voice would soon become a weapon. After I left Marlene's house for the last time, I didn't look back. I didn't cry either. I had learned early on that goodbyes were just moments dressed up as promises. But even as the state drove me to the next placement, I carried her with me, in the compass still tied to my neck, in the warmth of her pancakes, in the way she said I mattered without ever needing to explain why. The new family was different. They weren't just city people with spare rooms and tidy resumes. They lived on a farm, miles away from everything, in a place that smelled like earth and sweat and long days. Their names were Wade and Clara, and they had been fostering boys for over a decade. I was number 19. Their farmhouse sat at the edge of a wheat field that stretched like golden ocean. There were no televisions in the bedrooms and no locks on the doors. You had to earn trust with work. The first morning I woke up there, Wade handed me a pair of boots and said, "We rise early and sleep honest. You want to eat? You help." I didn't complain. I had slept in barns before. At least this time, someone knew I was there. The animals became easier to talk to than the people. The cows didn't ask questions. The chickens didn't pity me. There was something strangely healing about scooping hay and fixing fences. Each callus that formed on my hands felt like a stitch across the tear my father had left in me. I didn't know it then, but I was learning structure. I was learning endurance. I was learning how to build something from nothing, and not just with my hands. Wade was a man of few words, but when he spoke, it stuck. One afternoon, while we loaded hay bales into the barn, he looked at me and said, "Pain don't just disappear, son. You got to teach it where to live so it don't eat you." I didn't answer him. But that sentence followed me for years. I wrote it down in a notebook I kept hidden under my mattress, along with pieces of letters I'd written to a man who didn't deserve them. My father. Letters I never sent. Letters full of questions, accusations, curses, and the ache of a boy trying to become something without his roots. Every birthday on the farm, Clara made a pie instead of a cake. "Pies are real," she said. "Cakes are for show." I never told her why I couldn't look at candles without flinching. I just blew them out quickly, like a task to complete. But one year, when I turned 17, something changed. Clara handed me a slice of pecan pie and said, "You've been quiet too long. Whatever you need to do to make peace, you should start." I didn't respond that day. But I knew what she meant. It wasn't peace I was after. It was closure. And I was getting closer. The notebook was just a cheap spiral-bound thing with a torn cover and pages that curled from being stuffed under my mattress. But to me, it was sacred. It held everything I could never say out loud. I started writing the letters the night after my 17th birthday, Clara's words still echoing in my head like an invitation I wasn't ready to accept. Whatever you need to do to make peace, you should start. I didn't know what peace looked like, but I knew what rage felt like. It was thick, hot, and always just below the surface. So I started with that. The first letter began with, "You left me in a barn like garbage," and spiraled into 6 pages of questions I knew I'd never get answers to. But writing it made something shift, not softer, but clearer. I wrote him every week after that. Some letters were brutal, written through clenched teeth and tear-stained paper. Others were cold, almost detached, like I was filing a report about a man I barely remembered. Sometimes I told him about school, about the football game I played in, about how Wade taught me to drive the tractor, and how Clara once stitched up a cut on my hand better than any doctor. I told him about the nightmares, too. The ones where I woke up choking on silence, reliving the barn's shadows like they were tattooed on the inside of my eyelids. But mostly, I told him what he had done to me. I needed him to know. Even if he never read a word, I needed it on paper, proof that I had survived the version of me he abandoned. By the time I turned 20, the notebook was full. I never mailed a single letter. I didn't know where he was. I had stopped asking the state for updates years ago. And maybe I was afraid that he had moved on, that he had another family, that he had never looked back. But deep down, I hoped he had nightmares too, that every barn he passed reminded him of me, that somewhere his silence rotted just as loud as my memories did. One night, I burned the notebook in the fire pit behind the farmhouse. Page by page, I watched the words curl into ash. It wasn't forgiveness. It was a warning, to myself, that I wouldn't stay stuck in the space he left me. I would carry the pain, yes, but I'd also weaponize it, mold it, shape it into something he could never ignore. Because I didn't just want closure, I wanted confrontation. And even if the world had forgotten what he did to a 6-year-old boy in a red pair of sneakers, I hadn't. Not for 1 second. I didn't know where he was yet, but I had time. And soon, the same hands that wrote those letters would write something else entirely an invitation, one he couldn't ignore. For years, I referred to him only in the third person. The man. He. Him. Never Dad. That title felt like a betrayal to the boy who waited in that barn, holding on to a slice of cake and a lie. Even his real name made my jaw tense. Sam. Short, sharp, too easy to forget. And yet, it followed me like smoke clinging to clothes long after the fire's out. People would ask sometimes teachers, therapists, caseworkers, "Do you want to talk about your father?" I'd shake my head, not because I didn't want to, but because calling him that gave him a dignity he hadn't earned. My father didn't raise me. The farm did. Marlene did. Pain did. After I burned the notebook, I tried to leave him behind in my mind. I focused on getting out. College became my escape tunnel. I won a scholarship for writing, ironically. Words had been my weapon, my therapy, and now my ticket. The campus was 100 miles from the farm, and yet I still flinched every time I saw a gray truck, still avoided barns, still couldn't bring myself to write his name on any form that asked for father's details. I left it blank, or sometimes I'd write deceased, not because I believed he was dead, but because I needed him to be. But one fall afternoon in my junior year, something shifted. I was researching old property sales for a class project when I saw it. A deed from 2 years earlier. A name, Sam Calloway. Same as mine. Same as the man who left me. The document said he'd purchased a small business 2 towns over, a mechanic shop. My pulse throbbed in my ears. I didn't tell anyone what I saw. I just printed the page and folded it into my wallet like a secret I wasn't ready to say aloud. That night, I stared at his name for hours. I traced the letters with my thumb. It didn't look like him. It looked official, like something that belonged to a man with responsibilities, a man who stayed. But I knew better. That name had once belonged to someone who taught me how to ride a bike, and then taught me what it felt like to be discarded. I hated how my hands trembled holding that paper. I hated that after all these years, his name still had power over me. I could have let it go. I could have ripped it up and gone on pretending he no longer existed. But something in me had been waiting for that moment. A sign, a crack in the silence. He wasn't gone. He was alive. And now he had something to lose, which meant I had something to gain. Not revenge exactly, not yet, but the start of something. A door, barely cracked, just wide enough for a ghost to step through. I still didn't speak his name aloud, but I wrote it on an envelope the next day, not for mailing, just for practice, because soon I'd be saying it to his face. I didn't visit him right away. I carried that printed deed in my wallet for months, folded so many times the ink had started to fade. I'd take it out late at night when the dorm room was dark and quiet, running my fingers over the name like it might suddenly vanish again. But it didn't. And with every day that passed, the image of him working in some quiet mechanic shop grew louder in my mind. I imagined him smiling at customers, sipping coffee, changing tires like a man with no skeletons buried behind rusted barn doors. It made me sick, the thought that he'd found peace while I still carried his silence like a curse. That winter, the rage returned, and with it, the recklessness. I was home from school for the break and staying with Wade and Clara. The farm was the same, steady and honest. But I wasn't. I had grown restless, bitter even, dragging every conversation back to nothing. Clara tried to talk me down one evening, saying gently, "Just because you found him doesn't mean you're ready to face him." I barked something cruel in return, something I regretted before it even left my lips. I stormed out of the house into the dark, heart thundering, head spinning. I walked to the edge of the property where the old barn stood, the one Wade had been meaning to tear down for years. It looked nothing like the barn from my childhood, but that night, it became a stand-in, a proxy for everything I couldn't burn in real life. I found an old gas can in the shed and poured a slow trail around the structure. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I just wanted something to fuel the fire I'd lived with for 20 years. The match flared and dropped before I could talk myself out of it. The flames caught fast. I stepped back, watching them lick up the wood like hunger. It was only when the wind shifted and smoke clawed into my lungs that I realized I'd made a mistake. The fire spread faster than I expected, and I stumbled back, coughing, eyes watering. I tripped over a root and hit the frozen ground hard, gasping. Wade was the one who found me. He'd seen the glow from the kitchen window and came running with a fire extinguisher and fury in his bones. He didn't speak until the fire was out and I was standing, shaking in my soot-streaked clothes. He didn't yell either. He just looked me in the eyes and said, "You can't kill your ghosts by setting fire to someone else's house." That night changed everything. I could have died. I nearly did. And for what? Symbolism? Anger? I knew then that I needed a new way forward. Something calculated, measured, controlled. I didn't want flames. I wanted clarity, not a spark, but a spotlight. And now, more than ever, I knew exactly where to shine it. After the fire, something inside me cooled, but it didn't disappear. It hardened. The recklessness burned off in those flames, but the purpose it left behind was sharper, cleaner. Wade didn't talk about the barn again. Clara just hugged me tight the morning I left to return to college, whispering, "Don't let your pain make you small, make it useful." That became my mantra, and when I walked back into my dorm, past the rows of students laughing and buzzing about internships and weekend plans, I knew I wasn't like them. They were chasing careers. I was chasing a shadow. I changed my major to journalism, not because I wanted to write for newspapers, but because I wanted access public records, people, tools that could help me peel back every layer of the man who left me. I wanted to understand his world, not to join it, but to use it against him. Every elective I took was a brick in the foundation of something much bigger: investigative research, criminal psychology, digital forensics. While others were studying for grades, I was studying for strategy. I didn't tell anyone. This was mine, my quiet war. I started building a file on him. I found out that he had moved twice in the last 5 years, each time to a smaller town. He owned a mechanic shop under his full name, Sam Calloway. No aliases, no secrets, like he had nothing to run from. I tracked down old neighbors, past landlords, scanned every social media post from the town he lived in. There weren't many, but there was enough. I found one blurry photo of him in a local paper, shaking hands with the sheriff after donating tires to the department. I stared at that image for an hour. He looked older, softer, heavier around the eyes, but it was him, that smile, that same smile he gave me before he walked away. I printed that picture and tacked it above my desk, not out of nostalgia, but focus. Every time I saw it, it reminded me why I couldn't move on, why closure wasn't enough. I didn't want to scream at him or punch him in the face or even cry. I wanted him to look into the eyes of the boy he left behind and see a man he couldn't ignore. I wanted him to feel what I felt every year when my birthday rolled around and silence greeted me instead of love. So I wrote my senior thesis not on corruption or politics like the others, but on abandonment. I titled it, Ghost Fathers and the Children They Leave Behind. It was clinical, detailed, seething beneath the surface. And buried within those pages was the first draft of the plan that would bring him back to that same barn 25 years later. Only this time, I wouldn't be the one left standing in the dust. He would. And I wouldn't be asking questions. I would be giving answers. The photo in the article haunted me, not because of how different he looked, but because of how familiar that smug expression still was. It was the same face that had knelt beside me on my 6th birthday and handed me a compass with a lie behind his eyes. I thought it would be harder to find him after all this time, but in truth, the world isn't as big as it pretends to be when a man leaves behind a child. One breadcrumb led to another. I found his business listing online, Callaway's Auto and Repair, right there on Main Street in a town I had never heard of, population just under 3,000. The website had a 5-star rating, clean layout. He offered honest work at fair prices. I almost laughed when I read that. Honest. The man couldn't even tell the truth to a 6-year-old boy who begged to know why his father disappeared into dust. But now that I had him, I didn't rush. I spent weeks just observing from a distance. I drove out on weekends, parked across the street, and watched through the windshield. I saw how the customers greeted him, how they laughed with him, how he held open the door for an elderly woman and wiped his hands on a rag like some small-town saint. No one saw a monster. No one knew. That's when the idea came. This man had reinvented himself, erased the past with time and good manners, but I hadn't forgotten, and I wasn't interested in revenge by violence or spectacle. I wanted something slower, something surgical, something that would make him sit in the truth he had buried. It started with anonymous letters. Typed. No return address. The first one arrived at his shop on a Tuesday. It said only 5 words. Do you remember the barn? I knew he would. The second letter arrived a week later. Did he cry when you left? I pictured him opening them, alone behind the counter, heart skipping, hands shaking as the past leaked back in like smoke under a door. I watched from across the street as he opened the envelopes. He looked up after reading the second one, searching the street with narrowed eyes, but he couldn't see me. Not yet. The third letter was longer. It spoke of hay dust and birthday cake, of a boy waiting long after the sun disappeared, of a promise shattered beneath wooden rafters. Still, I didn't sign my name. I wanted him to stew, to wonder, to dread, because for the first time in 25 years, he didn't get to control the story. He didn't get to walk away. I did. And soon I'd be standing in front of him, not as his son, not as a boy begging for love, but as a man who remembered everything and planned accordingly. It was time he came back to the barn, whether he wanted to or not. By the time I sent the 4th letter, I knew he would start to unravel, and he did. I watched from my car as he stood outside his shop for almost an hour that day, pacing, glancing over his shoulder like a man being followed by footsteps no one else could hear. The confident mechanic, the man with the clean work apron and calm voice, now looked like he was choking on air. I didn't feel guilty. I felt justified. For years, I had memorized every breath of that day in the barn. Now he was finally tasting the same kind of slow dread I had carried since I was 6. But something else surprised me. He looked older than I imagined, weaker, not just in age, but in spirit. There was no menace left in his posture, just fear. And somewhere in that moment, I realized the most unsettling part: he wasn't the same man anymore. But neither was I. The boy who had waited with a crumpled slice of cake and the echo of silence had been replaced by someone meticulous, controlled, patient. The fire inside me hadn't gone out, but it had changed temperature. I didn't want to hurt him, not physically. I wanted him to face the story he tried to forget. I wanted him to feel the full weight of a memory he thought would never surface again. I didn't want justice through flames or fists. I wanted it through truth, but truth delivered on my terms. I kept watching. One Saturday, he closed the shop early. I saw him pull out a small notebook and scribble something down before locking the door and walking to the diner 2 blocks down. I followed him inside, sat at the counter near the back. He didn't recognize me. Of course he didn't. 25 years changes a face. He looked tired, eyes sunken, hands trembling slightly as he stirred his coffee. I watched him read and reread the note he had just written. His lips moved, as if mouthing words he didn't have the courage to speak. I wondered if he was trying to rehearse an apology to no one, or maybe to a son he thought he'd never see again. I sat there for nearly an hour, just feet away, and he never noticed. That's when I knew I had already won part of the battle. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was in control, and still I didn't speak. Not yet. This wasn't the place. Not the way I wanted him to remember me. I didn't want to be the ghost that whispered. I wanted to be the storm that walked through the door. So I paid for his coffee on my way out and left no name. Just a note under his mug, written in the same font as the letters before. It's almost time. He wouldn't sleep that night, and I didn't want him to, because soon the invitation would arrive, and he'd have no choice but to accept. The envelope was simple, white, clean, no return address. Inside it, a single piece of paper folded in half. On it, printed in the same font as the letters before, were the words, "You owe me 1 birthday." Underneath, a date, time, and coordinates. That was it. No name, no plea, no threat, just a directive. I sent it through a courier, one who didn't ask questions. Someone paid in cash to deliver a sealed envelope to Callaway's Auto and Repair and place it directly into his hand. I didn't watch him receive it. I didn't need to. I had already seen enough of his unraveling. This part needed to unfold without my eyes on him, because this part was no longer about surveillance. It was about response. I wanted to see what kind of man he would be when cornered by a memory he couldn't talk his way out of. The date I chose was intentional, the same day he left me, my 31st birthday, a full 25 years since I waited in the shadows of a collapsing barn with a paper napkin clenched in my hand. I picked a location just outside town, far enough to make him drive and feel the weight of every mile. The coordinates led to an old restored barn, rented for a single night under a false name. I had cleared the space. No hay, no animals, just a chair in the center of the room, a small table beside it, and 2 slices of cake, one untouched, one half-eaten, and dried from sitting out too long. The lights were dim, the air cold. I wanted him to feel the eeriness of the past, to sit in the silence he created. I arrived early and waited behind the second-floor loft, hidden from view. I watched the driveway through a crack in the wood, and then I saw his truck, older now, dull gray with a rusted tailgate, pull slowly down the gravel. He parked, engine running longer than needed before it sputtered off. He stepped out like a man walking into his own funeral, slow, hesitant, eyes scanning the dark. When he opened the barn door, he stopped. He saw the chair, the cake, the compass hanging on the nail. His shoulders sagged. He stepped inside. I could have revealed myself then, but I didn't. I wanted him to sit, to feel it, to let the silence wrap around him the same way it had wrapped around me as a child. He didn't call out. He didn't leave. He walked to the chair, looked at the compass, and sat down like he knew he deserved whatever was coming. And maybe he did, because for the first time in 25 years, the man who left me had nowhere to go. And I was finally ready to speak, not with anger, not with tears, but with truth sharpened by time. The reckoning had begun. The floor creaked beneath his boots, just like it had beneath mine all those years ago. The sound sent a shiver through my spine. He didn't know I was watching him from above, tucked in the shadows of the old loft that overlooked the entire space. I had left nothing to chance. Every detail in that barn was crafted to make him feel what I had felt, abandoned, confused, and small. But it wasn't vengeance I was tasting in that moment. It was memory, pure, unfiltered memory, and it pressed down on me like fog made of grief. He stared at the chair for a long time before finally lowering himself onto it. I could tell by the way he moved that his knees weren't what they used to be. His hands rested on his thighs, twitching just slightly. I could see the way his eyes flickered from the table to the compass and then to the untouched slice of cake. It was chocolate just like the one he gave me that day. Or rather, the one he let me take with me when he walked out. I still remembered holding that piece so tightly it crumbled in my hands. The barn I had rented wasn't the original, but it didn't have to be. My mind had preserved every crack and splinter of the real one so vividly that this place became a living replica. I'd spent weeks preparing it. I sourced similar boards, mimicked the layout, even brought in the same type of metal pail that once sat beside me while I cried in the straw. I wanted to resurrect the place he thought had disappeared, because it hadn't, not in my mind, not in my bones. He shifted in the chair again. Then he did something unexpected. He spoke. "I don't know who you are," he said, voice quiet, hoarse like it hadn't been used in days. "But I think I know why I'm here." He paused and looked around, eyes scanning every corner. Then he added, "I think I've known for a while now. I just didn't know how long I could outrun it." I didn't answer. Not yet. I wanted him to sit with those words, to let them echo. He leaned forward and picked up the compass from the nail. He turned it over in his hands like it was a sacred object, not a relic of cowardice. "I gave this to my son once," he whispered. "Told him it would help him find his way. I guess he did." The silence after that was heavy. But it wasn't empty. I stepped back from the loft and made my way down the old steps, boots echoing in the stillness. Each step felt like the final page of a book I had waited my whole life to finish. When I reached the bottom, he turned toward the sound and our eyes met. I didn't need to say who I was. He already knew. His mouth opened slightly when our eyes met, but no words came out at first. I could see the recognition hit him like a wave breaking across his face. The color drained from his skin. His lips parted again, trying to form a name he had long buried. My name. But I didn't give him the satisfaction of hearing it yet. I didn't walk closer. I didn't sit down. I simply stood there, letting the weight of my presence do what no letter, no memory, no courtroom could ever do. Make him look at what he left behind. He finally broke the silence, his voice thin and unsure. "Eli?" I didn't respond. He ran his hand down his face and looked away, like he couldn't bear the sight of me. "You look just like your mother," he mumbled, and I nearly laughed. It was a coward's reflex, shifting the attention, hoping nostalgia might soften me. It didn't. I didn't speak. Not yet. Instead, I gestured to the chair. "Talk," I said. "You owe me that." He looked down, rubbed the compass between his fingers, and swallowed hard. Then he started. "I was 27, scared, alone. Your mother left, and I didn't know what to do with a 6-year-old boy who asked too many questions and reminded me too much of everything I had failed at. I told myself I'd come back. I really did, that I'd just take a few days, clear my head, figure things out, then return. But I didn't. I drove away and never turned around. And every year after that, it got harder to explain why. So I stopped trying." I remained silent. "I've thought about you every day," he said, voice cracking. "Every birthday, I'd wonder where you were, what kind of man you'd become. I kept telling myself you'd be better off without me, and that lie got comfortable." I stepped closer, not out of sympathy, but control. "You left me with a compass and a cake," I said, "like I was a chore. Like I was weight you could just drop off." He nodded, shame burning in his eyes. "I know, and I've never forgiven myself for that." I leaned forward, resting both hands on the table beside the cake. "Good," I said, calm but sharp, "because I didn't come here to forgive you." He opened his mouth to speak, but I cut him off with a slow shake of my head. "No interruptions. I listened to your excuses. Now you're going to listen to the life I lived without you. Every detail, every scar, every birthday." His lips closed, his shoulders dropped. He nodded. And that was the moment he realized this wasn't just a reunion. It was a reckoning. Because letting him talk was never about healing. It was about preparing him for the truth. And the truth had teeth. I pulled the letter from my coat pocket with deliberate care, as if it were a fragile relic, not a document written for war. I had rewritten it more than a dozen times over the years, each version sharper than the last. This final one was not a plea. It was not even an accusation. It was a ledger, an account of the cost of his absence. And now I wanted him to read every word aloud, not for apology, not for closure, for clarity, because sometimes the only way to break silence is to force someone to choke on it. I placed the letter on the table beside the cake, the same place he once left a child like a forgotten errand. "Read it," I said, out loud. His hands trembled slightly as he picked it up. His eyes scanned the first line and he hesitated. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I just waited. After a long breath, he began. "To the man who gave me his name, but not his presence." His voice cracked, barely above a whisper. I didn't soften. "You left me on my 6th birthday in a barn with no explanation, no return, and no idea what I had done to deserve that silence." Each word pulled the air tighter around us. I watched his throat flex, his shoulders twitch. I carried that moment into every classroom, every foster home, every birthday party where my name was written on a cake no one knew how to spell. I memorized the sound of trucks pulling away and the way doors close without goodbye. He paused, eyes flickering up at me, desperate for mercy. I gave none. By the time I was old enough to understand what abandonment meant, I was too familiar with the shape of it. It looked like you. It sounded like the silence after asking, "When's he coming back?" and being met with a shrug. The paper shook in his hands now. I became a man without a father, but I also became a man in spite of one. I learned to survive. I learned to speak. I learned to wait. And in waiting, I learned how to become something your absence could never erase. He looked up again. "I'm sorry," he said. I held up a finger. "Finish it." His eyes dropped to the page. "This is not a request for reconciliation. It is not a cry for healing. This is a reminder. You left a boy in a barn, but the boy grew up, and he remembered." He folded the paper and placed it back on the table. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The barn felt heavy with everything it had witnessed, then and now. And then I said, "That's your legacy." He didn't argue, because when you make someone read what they've buried, you force them to feel every nail in the coffin of their own myth. And he felt it, every syllable. He didn't speak again after reading the letter. The silence that settled between us wasn't just awkward, it was heavy, final. The kind of silence that replaces punishment when there are no authorities to intervene, no courtroom to issue a verdict. I watched him shrink in that chair, eyes lowered, hands still resting on the folded paper like it might warm him somehow. But there was no comfort left in that barn, only consequence. And I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to break down. Justice had already been served the moment he heard his own choices read aloud in his own voice. I stepped forward and placed a small square box beside the letter. He looked at it with confusion but didn't touch it. I nodded. "It's a birthday gift," I said, "from the son you left behind." His fingers hovered over the box for a moment before he opened it. Inside was the same compass he'd given me on that awful day, except now it was cracked across the glass, the needle permanently stuck, pointing nowhere. I had kept it all these years, not because I believed in what it stood for, but because it reminded me that direction was something I had to create for myself. He picked it up, staring at the fracture, running his thumb over the broken face. I could see something crumble in his expression, a memory, maybe a regret, but it didn't change anything. "I followed that for a long time," I said softly, hoping it would lead me back to something whole, but it only taught me how to survive. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "You did more than survive," he said. "You became something I never could have imagined." "You're right," I replied. "You couldn't have imagined it, because imagining something requires staying long enough to see it grow." He winced at the truth, but he didn't protest. There was no defense left in him, not after the letter, not after the compass, not after the birthday he'd finally attended, even if it was 2.5 decades late and built on reckoning rather than celebration. I reached into my coat and handed him one last envelope. "This is the last thing you'll get from me. I said. Inside is everything you missed. Photos, milestones, even a copy of my graduation speech. You weren't there for any of it, but now you'll have to live with knowing what you walked away from. He took it without looking inside. He held it like something too fragile to open. I turned to leave. The barn door creaked open as I stepped into the night air, cool and sharp. I didn't look back. I didn't have to, because justice doesn't always come with noise or rage. Sometimes it comes with a chair, a letter, a cracked compass, and a man forced to sit inside the silence he built. And in that silence, I left him. The cold air hit me like a curtain as I stepped out of the barn. It was still. No wind, no sound, just the heavy stillness that follows a storm after it's torn through everything in its path. Behind me, the barn remained silent. I knew he was still sitting there, probably holding the envelope, probably staring at the broken compass like it might somehow spin back time. But nothing spins back. Not time. Not decisions. And certainly not the kind of abandonment that severs something vital inside a child. I didn't wait for him to come after me. I didn't wait to hear his footsteps or his voice. This wasn't a moment built for apologies or reunions. It was a reckoning, and the reckoning was complete. I walked back to my car, each step feeling lighter than the last. Not because I had forgiven him, but because I no longer needed anything from him. Not words, not answers, not love, nothing. When I slid into the driver's seat and shut the door, the quiet inside the car was deafening. I sat there for a while, staring at the wheel, my hands resting in my lap. I thought about the 6-year-old boy who had once gripped a napkin with a piece of cake and waited for someone who never came back. I thought about the years that followed the homes, the birthdays spent in silence, the letters I wrote but never sent. And I thought about how this moment, this ending, wasn't really about him at all. It was about me, about finding a way to return to the place where it all broke and choosing to leave whole. It wasn't long before I saw him emerge from the barn. He looked older than before, like the weight of the night had aged him years. He moved slowly, the envelope tucked under one arm, the compass still clutched in one hand. Our eyes met across the distance, and for the first time, I saw something in him that resembled recognition, not just of who I was, but of who I had become. He didn't try to speak. He didn't wave. He just stood there, watching me as I started the car and backed out down the gravel path. He didn't follow. He just stood there, holding the past in his hands. I drove away from that barn without looking back. There was no need. I had reclaimed what I came for not from him, but from the ghost of a moment that had defined me for too long. And now he could sit with what he left behind, knowing that the boy he abandoned had grown into a man who didn't need him anymore. He walked out on me once, but I walked away, and that made all the difference. The road away from the barn stretched out like a ribbon unwinding from a place I no longer feared. Every mile I put between us felt like a mile earned, not escaped. I didn't drive fast. I didn't need to. There was no urgency anymore. No ache clawing at my chest for answers. That barn had taken so much from me, but it had also given something back, something I never expected to find in the same place I was left behind. It gave me release, and with it, the freedom to decide what came next, not as a boy seeking healing, but as a man choosing purpose. I finished my degree that spring, with honors, not because I wanted accolades, but because I had already proven I could build something from ruins. After graduation, I took a job teaching creative writing at a high school not far from the farm. Most people asked why I didn't aim higher, didn't move to the city, or chase some shining journalism career, but they didn't understand. My work wasn't about headlines. It was about giving kids the tools I had to find myself through words, through stories, through the quiet power of expression. I wasn't just teaching English. I was teaching survival through sentences. Every year on my birthday, I still bought a slice of chocolate cake, not out of bitterness, out of ritual, a reminder. I didn't light candles. I didn't make wishes. I just sat with the silence, honoring the boy who waited too long and the man who finally walked away. Some years I gave the slice to a stranger, sometimes to a student, but I always bought two, one for me and one for the memory that no longer controlled me. I never told anyone at work about what happened. Not in full. But I shared pieces of it when it mattered. when a student said they felt invisible, when someone admitted they didn't know how to forgive a parent who vanished. I didn't offer cliches, I offered presence. And in doing so, I found healing in places I never expected, not in apologies, not in revenge, but in quiet choices, like showing up, staying, listening. As for him, I never saw him again. I didn't need to. I imagined he kept the letter, maybe even framed it, or maybe he buried it in the bottom of a drawer, afraid of what it said but too ashamed to throw it away. Either way, it was his now, not mine. Marlene passed a few years later. I spoke at her memorial. I called her my compass, the real one, the kind that points you home even when you've forgotten where that is. Wade and Clara came too. They cried when I thanked them publicly for giving me structure when all I had was silence. Afterward, Clara squeezed my hand and said, "You made it." And I did, not because he came back, but because I finally walked forward. When I stood in that barn for the second time, staring into the eyes of the man who once drove away from me without a backward glance, I realized something he hadn't. He still believed he had the power to abandon, the power to vanish, the power to define the silence. But he was wrong, because in that moment when he read my words, when he held the broken compass, when he saw what I had become, I wasn't the boy in the barn anymore. I was the one who brought him there. I was the one who watched him squirm under the weight of truth. That was the power reversal. He walked in expecting a confrontation. He left with a legacy of failure he couldn't rewrite. I didn't need him to suffer. I only needed him to remember. And as for me, I built a life of meaning, not despite what he did, but because I refused to let his choices define my destination. Thousands of people have heard my story now. I've shared it in classrooms, at conferences, in quiet one-on-one moments where someone whispered, "That was me too." And every time, I see it the flicker of hope when someone realizes they don't have to carry the pain forever. If you're watching this and you've been left behind, know this: you are not your abandonment. You are not your trauma. You are not the silence someone else left you with. You are what you choose to become in spite of it. The compass may break, but you can still find your way. Thank you for watching. Her story is one of survival, truth, and finally choosing herself. To hear more stories like this, click on the left and make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. You are not alone in what you've lived.